My mother's crystal glass clinked, silencing the private dining room. We were celebrating my brother Brandon's master's acceptance. Instead of a toast, Patricia announced I would pay his $240,000 tuition. Her justification? I was unmarried and child-free. Brandon leaned back, radiating smug expectation. I didn't blink. I just delivered one flat, cold syllable. No. Have you ever felt like the invisible reserve account in your own family? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The entire room froze in stunned silence. Nobody expected the reserve account to decline a transaction. I didn't yell. I didn't cry or demand to know why they felt entitled to my life's earnings. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I simply stood up, pulled a $50 bill from my purse to cover my bar tab, placed it on the table, and walked out without a backward glance. The moment the valet handed me my keys, I opened my phone and logged into my corporate accounts. I didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. I just started clicking cancel, immediately revoking Brandon's access to my firm's emergency credit card. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and it was finally time to close the ledger. Driving home, the streetlights blurred past my windshield as I mentally audited the last 8 years of invisible subsidies. I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of family, footing the bill for a subscription I never agreed to. There was the unpaid condo rent when Brandon needed to find himself. There were the bailed-out car notes when he missed payments. There was the $7,500 family vacation to Cabo that they somehow framed as a necessary business equipment expense to bypass my boundaries. My parents, Patricia and Gregory, had completely normalized this extraction. To them, my financial discipline and lack of dependence didn't represent my hard work. It represented a collective family reserve account. In dysfunctional family systems, there is a phenomenon I like to call the single tax. It is the unwritten rule that the unencumbered, the ones without spouses or children, are automatically designated as the default shock absorbers for everyone else's poor choices. Because I didn't have a husband or a baby, my time was considered vacant, and my money was considered unallocated. My family looked at my empty guest room and saw a storage unit for their problems. They looked at my bank account and saw a communal safety net. Love, in their eyes, was simply a contract of convenience, and I had been paying the premium for years. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon some sense of familial regret, but there was only absolute clarity. I had spent nearly a decade absorbing the costs of their entitlement, acting as the logistical architect for their financial messes. They weren't shocked by what they had done in that dining room. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. The single tax was officially repealed. I was no longer the family's invisible ledger. My phone was already beginning to light up with missed calls and frantic text messages, the predictable panic of creditors who had just been cut off from their primary funding source. I silenced the device and focused on the road ahead. The audit was complete, and the account was closed. By the next morning, the family had mobilized. Their affection had always been transactional, but their organized hostility was highly efficient. Patricia was the first to strike, leaving a barrage of voicemails demanding to know what I was hoarding my wealth for. In her mind, my financial security was a direct theft from Brandon's potential. She spoke to me not as a daughter, but as a rogue asset manager withholding company funds. I listened to her voice waver between manufactured tears and cold commands, noting the complete absence of genuine care. I deleted the messages one by one. Brandon's retaliation was far more public and significantly more manipulative. Before noon, he uploaded a polished, professional photo to his social media profiles. It was a picture of us from a previous holiday, heavily filtered. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. So grateful for family sacrifice and the incredible support system making my executive master's journey possible. He tagged me directly. The implications were brilliantly deceptive. He was letting our mutual connections and extended relatives assume I was happily bankrolling his $240,000 education. It was social gaslighting on a grand scale, designed to force my hand through public pressure. I didn't engage in the comments. I didn't post a rebuttal. Arguing with them would only validate their premise that my resources were a subject open for public debate. Instead, I watched the notifications roll in, calculating my next move. They thought they were boxing me into a corner, relying on my historical compliance to avoid a public scene, but they had fundamentally miscalculated my emotional state. I wasn't mourning the loss of a brother or a mother. I was managing a hostile takeover attempt. The situation escalated precisely at 11:51 that night. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing supply chain algorithms, when my phone chimed with a high-priority automated alert. It was an official notification from Crestview Institute's financial portal. The email was cold and bureaucratic, confirming the receipt of a digitally signed institutional funding agreement. Brandon had forged my electronic signature on a DocuSign contract, submitting my business's corporate details and tax identification numbers as his primary institutional sponsor. He almost got away with it, but my corporate banking fraud alert system had flagged the unauthorized credit inquiry just in time. I stared at the glowing screen. The line between family entitlement and outright corporate fraud had just been obliterated. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical, sharp, and razor-focused. He hadn't just tried to manipulate me socially, he had weaponized my corporate identity to secure his conditional admission. I drafted the legal retraction with methodical precision, outlining the unauthorized use of my corporate entities. I attached my firm's legal counsel to the correspondence. Brandon believed he could forge a partnership agreement through sheer audacity and familial guilt. He thought my silence over the past 24 hours was a sign of surrender, a retreat into my usual quiet compliance. He failed to realize that in business, silence from the opposing party usually means they are preparing a devastating countersuit. I finalized the email to the admissions and finance departments of Crestview Institute. By 12:03, the retraction was sent. The trap he had set for me had just become his own legal snare. First thing, the following morning, I bypassed standard email channels and contacted Crestview Institute's finance office directly by phone. I spoke to a senior compliance officer, clinically explaining that my corporate information had been submitted fraudulently and requesting an immediate retraction of all sponsorship claims. The officer was highly apologetic, assuring me the file would be flagged. I thought the containment protocol was complete, simply severing the financial cord Brandon had tried to attach. I was wrong. The corporate theft ran much deeper than a forged sponsorship form. Less than 2 hours later, my direct line rang. The caller ID displayed Crestview Institute. I answered, expecting a follow-up from the finance department. Instead, a deep, measured voice introduced himself as Dean Marcus Sterling from Crestview's Venture Commercialization Lab. He wasn't calling about the tuition. He was calling to congratulate me on my firm's silent partnership in Brandon's groundbreaking new flagship logistics platform, which Brandon had named Nexus Flow. According to Dean Sterling, Brandon had leveraged this platform to win a highly prestigious, fully funded venture fellowship at the Institute. I sat frozen in my office chair, listening as the dean praised the intricate routing algorithms and the robust emergency medical supply chain models embedded in the proposal. The details he enthusiastically recited were disturbingly familiar. He was describing Apex Grid. Apex Grid was an emergency medical routing model I had built from scratch and shelved on my private corporate servers 4 years prior, deeming it too resource-heavy for immediate market deployment. Brandon hadn't just forged a sponsorship. He had stolen my intellectual property. "Dean Sterling," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, "I need you to run a metadata extraction on the core PDF files Brandon submitted." I guided him through the process step by step over the phone. Within minutes, the dean's enthusiastic tone evaporated into a stunned, heavy silence. The document properties and metadata archives didn't lie. They clearly displayed my firm's credentials as the original author, time-stamped 4 years before Brandon even applied to the program. He had simply slapped a new title page on my life's work. The professional escalation was immediate. Dean Sterling informed me that academic and commercial fraud of this magnitude would trigger an automatic integrity hearing. The fellowship was instantly suspended pending a formal investigation. I thanked him for his diligence and ended the call. Almost immediately, my cell phone began to vibrate violently across my desk. It was Brandon. He called once, twice, 5 times in rapid succession. The automated alerts from the university must have hit his inbox. The smug, entitled golden child was suddenly facing the catastrophic collapse of his stolen empire. I watched the screen light up with his incoming calls, feeling an absolute icy calm. I de-romanticized the relationship years ago, but this confirmed it. Love was a contract he had fundamentally breached. This wasn't about siblings fighting over a toy. This was corporate espionage committed by a parasitic liability. Brandon's frantic calls morphed into a barrage of text messages, shifting wildly between desperate pleas for a conversation and aggressive demands to know what I had told the dean. He was thrashing, realizing too late that his actions had professional, institutional, and legal consequences. I blocked his number temporarily. I needed absolute silence to trace exactly how he had infiltrated my network. The accounting was far from over. The server room of my firm was my sanctuary, a place of logic, binary rules, and undeniable facts. I dove into the deepest layers of my server logs, tracking the digital footprints with methodical precision. It didn't take long to find the breach. The logs revealed that Brandon had stolen the data using temporary administrative credentials. He had accessed an exported mirrored backup drive during his last visit to my apartment, downloading the entire Apex Grid architecture while I was in the other room. It was a sloppy, amateurish extraction, leaving a trail of timestamps pointing directly to his IP address. But the forensic trail didn't stop at intellectual property theft. As I cross-referenced the network traffic, I uncovered a cache of intercepted communications that tore away the final, thin veil of family loyalty. It was an email thread, and the participants weren't just Brandon. The devastating twist stared back at me in stark, black and white text. My mother, Patricia, had actively colluded in the theft. The emails showed she had forwarded my confidential Apex Grid PDF to Brandon weeks ago. Her accompanying message read, "Here is that file from your sister's office. Just make sure you change the title so Sydney doesn't get territorial about it." They hadn't just stumbled into stealing from me, it was premeditated malice. They had coordinated a raid on my professional assets, and the rot went even deeper. Further down the digital paper trail, I found documentation linking my father, Gregory. He had deliberately utilized my firm's employer identification number to quietly open multiple unauthorized corporate credit lines. The logs proved he had meticulously siphoned tens of thousands of dollars to fund his country club memberships and luxury car leases, completely bypassing my corporate banking oversight by routing digital statements to a dummy email. My father, the man obsessed with his pristine reputation, was orchestrating financial fraud using my business as his shield. The final piece of evidence was almost comical in its desperation. I found encrypted chat logs proving Brandon had hired an online freelancer from a gig website. He had paid them to fabricate 850 rural clinic validation interviews to make the Nexus Flow platform appear market-tested and viable. Every single metric, every piece of data he had submitted to Crestview Institute was a total fabrication. I printed everything: the emails, the IP logs, the employer identification number fraud documents, and the freelancer receipts. I stacked the papers into a thin, unadorned manila folder. There was no sadness left in me, no despair over the parents and brother who had conspired to strip mine my life. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a highly documented criminal enterprise. They had removed all possibility of villain redemption by proving their premeditated malice. The betrayal was absolute, but the data was beautifully devoid of emotion. They had operated under the assumption that family ties would forever shield them from scrutiny, that I would eternally play the role of the silent, footing-the-bill subscriber to their delusions of grandeur. They thought they could pillage my intellectual property just as easily as they had pillaged my bank account for vacations and car notes. But metadata knows no loyalty, and audit trails do not respect bloodlines. As I locked the server room door, I realized they weren't shocked by their own criminality. They were simply entirely confident they would never be caught. I was about to introduce them to the uncompromising reality of forensic accounting. Since the university's academic hearings strictly prohibit external attendees, I orchestrated my own tribunal. I summoned my family to a sterile, mahogany-paneled conference room at my corporate attorney's office under the guise of finalizing the tuition transfer. I walked in carrying nothing but a single, thin folder containing the time-stamped audit logs. Brandon arrived looking polished and irritatingly confident. He wasn't alone. He had brought an entire entourage to apply pressure. Patricia, Gregory, his fiancée Haley, and our Aunt Teresa. They sat in a united front, clearly expecting a negotiated family compromise. I didn't let them settle in. Instead of small talk, I pressed play on a recorded voicemail from Dean Sterling, explicitly detailing the immediate suspension of Brandon's fellowship due to severe intellectual property theft. Sensing the room violently turning against him, Brandon's confidence evaporated into sheer panic. Under the table, out of view of the others but perfectly visible to me, his hands trembled as he frantically tapped on his smartphone. He was attempting to remotely purge the shared cloud archive, hoping to destroy the stolen data. He didn't realize my network was actively monitored. Instantly, a stark, red, automated tampering alert flashed directly onto the room's presentation screen. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the conference room as the digital evidence of his cover-up was broadcast for everyone to see. When you hold absolute proof, you do not need to raise your voice. There is a profound dignity in undecorated evidence. I didn't yell. I didn't perform my pain or list the decades of emotional grievances. I simply let the silence do the heavy lifting. I opened my thin folder and slid the documents across the mahogany table. I presented the IP extraction logs, the unauthorized credit applications executed by Gregory, and the email thread where Patricia explicitly instructed Brandon to steal my work and change the title. Aunt Teresa stared at the email printouts, her hand covering her mouth in genuine horror as she read Patricia's treacherous words. Haley, Brandon's fiancée, looked physically ill, shifting her chair inches away from him as the scope of his lies became apparent. Gregory tried to open his mouth to offer a defense, perhaps a legal loophole to excuse his financial fraud, but my attorney raised a single hand, silencing him instantly, coldly reminding him that anything he said could be used in the impending civil suit. I looked at my family, not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of an auditor closing a bankrupt account. Their power over me had evaporated the moment the tampering alert flashed on the screen. The undeniable, cold, hard facts stripped them of any plausible deniability. The evidence was irrefutable, unadorned, and absolutely lethal. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting, and the ledger was finally balanced. The fallout was swift and absolute. Haley stood up, placed her engagement ring on the mahogany table, and walked out of the conference room without looking back. Aunt Teresa, disgusted by the undeniable proof of malice, officially defected. She walked over to my side of the table, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder, publicly separating herself from my parents. The consequences outside that room were just as severe. True to the voicemail, Crestview Institute formally expelled Brandon and permanently revoked his fellowship. Meanwhile, my legal team forwarded the documentation of Gregory's corporate credit fraud directly to state investigators. My father's precious reputation was instantly reduced to a criminal inquiry. As the conference room cleared, Brandon desperately tried to grab my arm, pleading with me to validate his lies, begging me to save him one last time. I didn't feel a shred of pity. I simply stepped back, looked him in the eye, and permanently blocked his and my parents' numbers on my phone right in front of him. I reclaimed the full rights to Apex Grid. Within 3 months, I successfully launched the platform, securing a massive multi-facility deployment contract with regional healthcare systems. The logistics model they tried to steal became the foundation of my greatest professional triumph. In the aftermath of the quiet, I began to understand the vital separation of love and bailouts. For years, I had believed that being a good daughter and sister meant acting as a shock absorber for their toxic choices. But I had to learn to reclaim the architecture of my own self. True compassion does not mean setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, and it certainly doesn't mean subsidizing their entitlement. A healthy relationship is a partnership, not a parasitic extraction. By severing the financial and emotional lifelines, I didn't just protect my assets. I starved the toxicity that had kept me trapped. When I look back on that day in the conference room, I don't feel anger anymore. I've come to realize that the family you are born into is merely a starting point, not a life sentence. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy anchor of the past. I had to forgive myself for letting them use me for so long. Letting go of my parents and brother wasn't an act of cruelty, but an act of profound self-preservation. Healing doesn't require reconciliation with those who broke you. It requires the absolute courage to look at the undeniable facts of how you were treated and decide you demand better. I built a beautiful, quiet sanctuary out of strict boundaries, and inside it, I found a sovereign peace I had never known. The ledger they couldn't erase finally allowed me to write a new beginning, entirely on my own terms. If you were in my place, would you stay silent to keep your family? Or tell the truth, even if telling it meant losing them? Share your thoughts below, and share this story with someone who needs the courage to protect their own boundaries.